Hi there. In this tutorial, we will dissect the promise APIs or the promise combinators that JavaScript provides for handling multiple promises concurrently. We will see how to handle the errors gracefully and how we can write polyfills for these APIs. Now, let's get started. I have a small example for you all. So, let me just move it to the center. Yeah. So, consider these two as two separate functions which are fetching data from two different APIs, right? And their response time are like 2000 millisecond and 1000 millisecond respectively. Now, consider a situation that these two functions will return two promises, let's say P1, and I have here P2. And I want to make sure that when we handle these promises concurrently, I want to make sure that if either of them fails, I won't go beyond that. I won't consider the other promise, even if it succeeds. So what I mean is, let's say this particular promise, let's say this fails, right? So let me just write it here. Let's say I collect these promises, and let's say P1 fails. So I want to make sure that even though P2 succeeds, I will show the error message in the console or in the web page or so on and so forth. So how can we do that? So we can use the promise APIs. In this case, in this scenario, we can use the promise.all, and we can pass the array of promises, right? So what this will do is, this will make sure that if any of the promises fails, it won't go beyond that. It won't consider the others, right? So let me show you in the code, and we'll dig deep into the polyfill, and we will check how this works, right? So I have VS Code opened, and let me just create two promises, P1, and I can just resolve it with a random value. I can do the same with another promise. Now I need to create an array, promises array, and I can store it in a variable res, and I will pass this into promise.all, and this will return a promise, right? This will return a resultant promise. And as you can see, we have values 1 and 2. Let's see if we can log them. We can log the data, right? So if I just console log, you can see the data has been logged. Now what if I reject one promise, right? So you can see that the promise has been rejected with the reason. The reason is the data that we have here. And so to gracefully handle this, what we can do is, we can probably show the error message, or let's say we can show failed, right? We have failed here. So this is how promise.all works, and I will go through each of the promise APIs, and I will show you the polyfills for all of them. So let me just create my own polyfill. Let's say my promise all, right? Which will be taking the promises array. As you can see here, it is taking the array here. So we can do the same, and then we can return a new promise, because as you know, this returns a new promise, a resultant promise, which is getting stored here in res. So similarly, we'll create a new promise and return the same, and we can have resolve and reject, right? And so now coming to the logic, right? So promise.all acts like short circuit, right? Because here, as you might remember, if any of the promises fails, we won't consider the other one. So it's like short circuiting method, right? So like if I just state the same statement here, if I just write it here, if any one of the promises fails, it wouldn't bother to go beyond. I think you can understand what I mean here. So how do we determine if I am doing the same operations, right? How can we determine the same? So firstly, first of all, what we need to do is we can, as you know, we are passing the whole array. So we need to go through each of the promise, right? So we need to loop through the promises. So for that, what we can use is we can use a for each loop. I don't want the template, right? And I have the promise here. By the way, if you don't know what this means, this is literally looping through each of the promises, and promise here means P1, and then it will loop through again, then it will be P2. So promise is each of the elements in the array, right? And then what we can do is we can take each promise. We can, let's say for the first time it is P1, the second time it is P2. So we can take each of the promise, and then similarly we can do something here, right? So as you know, we need to maintain the resultant resultant array so that it can be returned, right? So let me just maintain this resultant array, result. And also we need to maintain the number of tasks that have been completed till now. So there are P1 and P2 tasks here, right? And let's say P2 fails, like here P2 is failing, right? So if I am to summarize this, we need to make sure if there is any promise failing, we will immediately return that. We won't go and perform any operation. But we need to make sure if there is no failure, right? So if there is no failure, we need to maintain total number of promises, and we need to check if all the promises have been looped through and checked. So how can we do that? So for that we can create a variable completed tasks, and here if the promise is getting resolved, we can push the data into the result, and we need to also increment the completed tasks, right? But what if the promise fails? So we need to handle it in a catch, and we can just directly reject it, right? We can reject it directly. But so as you can see, if P2 fails, it will come to this block, and we are immediately rejecting this whole promise. So it won't even go beyond. So let me give an example. Let's say there are multiple promises after this, P3, P4, and so on, so forth. So let's say there are multiple promises after P2. Now P2 is getting rejected. So we won't even consider these promises. So we won't even loop through. We are directly rejecting this entire promise, right? But what if all of this resolves, right? So we need to make sure if the completed tasks is equal to the full promise array's length, right? Because we are maintaining this completed tasks whenever we are making sure that each of the promise is getting resolved. But we need to check if all of them have been resolved completely. So what we can do is we can compare it with the promise array.length, and then if it has been completed, we can just resolve it with the resultant array. right? This is what we were doing. So let's say I have this two promises, and instead of this, let's say, okay, let me just create a new variable, raise 2, my promise dot all this time, and we'll pass the promises array. And similarly, we can do the same here. This will be raise 2. We can just comment this out. Let me just run it. Sorry. Let me just run it. So yeah, you can see that it has been failed. Now let me just make it resolve. We should see 1 and 2 together. Okay, so this works. So let me just go through the code again, what we were doing. So firstly, we are passing these two promises in an array, and this function takes the array, right? Now let me just show you the function. And as I said, it works like a short circuit method, and if any of the promises fails, it wouldn't consider the rest of the promises in the array. Now we are returning, as you know, as I said before, promise.all returns a promise, right? So we are just storing the promise in the arrays. Promise.all returns a promise which will later get either resolved or rejected accordingly. If it is getting resolved, we are doing a then, and we are just console logging the data in the resolved value. Else we are catching the error and we are throwing this in. So what we are doing here is we are looking through each of the promise in the array, and for each promise, if it is getting resolved, let's say this P1 is resolved, right? So first it will go to this block and it will push the data in the result array, and I'm incrementing the completed tasks, and ultimately I'm checking if all of the, this means if all the promises have been resolved, have been checked in the resolved return result array, right? And if any of the promises fails, I will directly reject it, so it won't consider the other array elements if they are P3, P4. If P2 fails, it won't even go past this. So this is the polyfill of promise.all. So the next API that we will be looking into is the promise.all settled. So let me give you an example. Let me just show you an example of what it does. First of all, it will take the promise array, and if I just uncomment this and replace comment this, so it's called promise.all settled. So what it does is, so it will wait for all the promises to be settled. By settled, I mean it can be either success or failure. It doesn't mean it will always be success. So settle can be either failure or success, right? So let me just show you an example. We are taking the same example. Let me just remove this. We don't need this polyfill here. I'll be putting the source code in the description anyway, so no issue. So as we had before, we have two promises which are getting resolved with values 1 and 2, and we are having a promises array which will contain these two promises, and promise.all settle will return it will wait for all the promises to get settled, and it will return after all the promises is settled. It will return a promise which will then get either rejected or resolved accordingly. And let me just run this. If I can track this up, yeah. As you can see, we have these two promises and their status are fulfilled, and we have the values 1 and 2. Now what if I reject one, right? As you can see, we have two statuses. One status indicates that one promise has been resolved, the other is rejected, right? So if I am to summarize what it does, I will write it here. Waits for all promises, right? The keyword is all here, to be settled. And by settled, I mean it can either be failure or success. It doesn't mean settled doesn't mean it will always be a success, right? So we can start with our own implementation of this API. We just start with this. My promise all settled. Okay, I missed a T here. And similarly, it will take the promise array, and the pattern is similar to the one we did before. It will return a new promise, which will be the resolve or reject accordingly. And just so you know, these are callback function that we are taking, which will be having resolve and reject. And similarly, we can just loop through each of the promises because we are receiving the promise array, and we can do a for each. I can just go through each promise in the array, and for each promise, we can do something, right? Now, let me show you the structure of the resultant array, right? So as you can see, we are having status and value, right? So we can just keep our result array here, result, and we can just push this similar object here. It will have a status. Am I typing correctly? Yeah. So it will have a status of fulfilled, and the value here denotes the data here, right? Correct? Because I can have values like 1 and 2, which are getting stored in the data, and then the data can be set to value, like here. I hope you get that, this basic JavaScript. Then what we can do is, in case it's rejected, so similarly we can do the same. The status is rejected, and the rejected will be having a reason, which is the error here. My bad. Yeah, this is error here. I need to remove the semicolon. Okay, so we have stored these status and the values. As you might remember, it will wait for all the promise to be settled, right? It won't directly and suddenly stop the execution. It will wait for all the promises to be settled, and it will return a resultant promise of all of them, right? So instead of doing then and catch, and apart from doing then and catch, we can also do a finally, right? Which will return the resultant of all this together. But how can we determine that all of the promises have been processed? So we can just store here something like settled count, right? And then we can, after every execution, we can just increase this, and we can check if settled count is equal to the promise array dot length. So we can just directly resolve with this, right? Result. Cool. So this should work. Let me just check what we need to change here. Okay, so we can just change to my promise all settled, right? Yeah, this should work. Let me just check. We are getting an error. Let me just see. My bad. This should be. Yeah, so you can see we are getting this array with status and values. And let's say I do both of them as resolved. We're getting fulfilled, right? So you might notice one thing. We don't require reject here. It's also grayed out. So because we don't encounter a situation where we need to reject, right? We are always waiting for all the promises to get settled, and it resolves that matters here. So if I just run it again, you can see it runs well. If I change it to reject, we can see it's working. So yeah, this is all about my promise all settled. Let's move on to the next. So the next promise API that we would use is promise.any. Let me just show you an example. So what does promise.any do? Right, so I will write the summary here, what it does. It waits for the first success, right? First success of, if I can type promise. So in promise.all settled, we are waiting for all the promises to get settled. We aren't checking if we are getting success or failure. We are waiting for all the promises to get settled. It can be success or failure accordingly. But in case of promise.any, it will wait for the first success, right? It will wait for the first success to happen, and if all the promises are rejected, it will give an aggregate error comprising the promise getting rejected for all the same. So let me just show you a demonstration for promise.any. As you can see, we are encountering the resolve first and also the reject. So as I said here, it will wait for the first success of a promise, which is resolve. So it encounters that, yeah, we are getting one resolve, so we will be directly returning that. And let's say I have this reject too. So I can just show you the error here instead of a message. Yeah, as you can see, we get an aggregate error. All promises were rejected. So we can start writing with the polyfill. Let me start with this. The pattern remains the same. My promise any receives promise array, return new promise. As usual, it will be having resolve and reject in the callback as parameters, and then we can loop through each other promise. And if it succeeds, right, so we can just directly return it, resolving the same, because it won't wait for, like, it will just wait for the first success, right? It won't consider if I have something other than this apart from that. So as you might remember, in the very beginning we did promise.all, which looks for the if we are getting an error, we will directly return that error, right? So it is like kind of the opposite, because we are looking for the first resolve here. So let me just try to resolve here. Let's say I have multiple promises, P3, P4, so on, and P1 resolves at first. So whenever it sees that, yeah, it is getting resolved, it won't look further, right? So it's like a short circuiting, you can see, and we are just directly resolving it. And similarly, we can catch the error And as you might remember, we are showing an aggregated error. So for that, we need to keep a counter if all of the promises have been processed. And also we will return the error array, let's say with this error. And here what we can do is we can push the error here, right? My bad, what is happening? Error dot push, we are pushing the error here. So if both of them are rejected here, so it will be pushing 1, 2 and so on. And what we can do is, after, if we're getting into the catch block, it means the error count will be increased by 1. And we also need to check if do I have, okay, if error count promises array dot length, if every promise has been processed, we need to return the aggregate error. And in JavaScript we can just use the aggregate error constructor. Aggregate error, I guess, yeah, it is correct. So we can just pass in the errors here, which is the array. And if you might remember, the message was all promises were rejected, right? Correct. Yeah, so after this we can just directly reject with the aggregate error, right? I guess this will work. Let me just check. Okay, what we're getting, promise error. Okay, sorry, my bad. What we're getting, let me just check. Could not read properties of undefined. My bad. This will be here after everything has been done. Okay, we are already putting the bracket here there, sorry. What is it again? Dot catch unexpected token. Aren't we closing it? Let me see the... Okay, so I just fixed the brackets. It was messing up a bit. Anyway, as you can see, I have run this program and this aggregate error has been shown to us with the same message that you have seen before. But now we are just using our polyfill. Let me just go through it once more. First of all, promise.any waits for the first success of the promise. So if there are multiple promises in the array, it won't look beyond after a certain time if one of them is succeeded, and it will return a promise which is getting stored in the arrays variable. We are then doing the normal stuff. We are just also logging the data here, and if it's an error, we are just logging the error if it's rejected. So these are all polyfill, and we are receiving the promise array here, right? And then we are looking through each of the promises, and also, by the way, we are also obviously returning a promise from this function, and we are looking through each of the promises in the array, and if it is resolved, we are just resolving with the data directly. Don't wait further, right? Because this is what promise.running does. It won't wait further. If it sees that one of the promises have been resolved, it will directly resolve it with the value. Else, if it is rejected, like both of them are rejected here, right? So it will go to the catch block here, and we have an error array which will contain these error messages for here 1 and 2. So we are just pushing this into the array, and we are also maintaining an error count which will signify if all of the all of the promises have been processed and all of the promises are rejected. So we are maintaining this, and upon getting equaled with the promise array length, we are showing an aggregate error with this message, and we are rejecting it with this error. So for the next promise API, we have promise.race, right? So the word race signifies the one who comes first, right? In a marathon or in something like that, you can imagine. So what it does is, let me just show you promise.race. So what promise.race does is it gives value of the first settled promise, right? So it can be it either success or failure. So the moment it sees that a promise is being settled, it will return that promise. It can be rejected or it can be resolved. It can be success or failure. So let me just show you an example. As you can see, okay, promise any, my bad. So as you can see, we have two promises which are getting rejected, right? So I think I can just create some delay, right? Just to show you that it is really getting the first settled. Because let's say I have two promises, P1, which is getting resolved in 1500 milliseconds, and I have P2, which is getting resolved in or rejected in 2000 milliseconds. So it will check for the first settled promise, which is P1 here. So it will be returning P1 to us. So let me just change these two promises maybe. Right. I can just do a fake delay kind of thing. Imagine we are just, fetching this from an API. So this will resolve here. We are doing a resolve first, and we can do a set timeout. Right, and let's say I have 2000 or 1500 milliseconds here, and we are resolving, right? And similarly, we have P2 here, which is getting resolved in maybe 2000 milliseconds, right? So according to this statement, it will check the first promise getting settled. First promise that is getting settled. It can be either success or failure. Maybe I can just do a reject here, and I can directly reject from here, so that you can just check that it doesn't matter if we're rejecting or resolving. So it checks that, okay, first we're getting the resolve here. So in 1500 milliseconds, we are getting the first settled promise. So it will just return this. Let me show you. And we can resolve it with some values, maybe 1. And we can just reject with 2, maybe. Okay, we are getting 1. Yeah. So as you can see, after 1500 milliseconds, this is getting processed. And the promise race does this. Now, what if I have something with 700 milliseconds, right? So yeah, you can see that since this comes first, since this is getting settled first before this, it is getting shown, right? So this is how promise dot race works. Now we can just write our own polyfill. Maybe we can just collapse this. And obviously the pattern will be the same as we are writing my promise race. We're taking the promise array and we're returning a new promise, right? Which will take resolve and reject. Okay, now we can just loop through. for each, and for each promise we can just, if it is like resolved, then we can just directly return this. But that is the easiest that we will see for the polyfill, because we are just directly resolving it, right? We don't need to do anything like no checks or whatsoever. And if it is rejected, we can just reject this, right? What the error is, let me just check. Cool. So basically what's happening is we have two promises. One is getting resolved in 1500 milliseconds and one is getting rejected in 700 milliseconds. So obviously 700 milliseconds will come first in this function, and it sees, okay, it is getting rejected, so it will directly reject it, right? It won't go any further in the loop. We are directly returning it, right? So yeah, it should work, I guess. Let me just change this. Yep, 2 is getting shown. Let me just change the value here. Let me just give a smaller value, so I should get 1, right? So yeah, this works. These are all the promise APIs that you might encounter in your projects or in your interviews. So this is like a summarization of the promise APIs, and I hope that you get a gist of it. I will put down the source code in the description. And just so you know, I want to show you like something related to promise that might be useful in simulating an API or like a deep sleep simulation, So it's like a deep sleep. So what we can do is we can return a promise, and this is like really handy to know if you haven't checked out this before. So we can just create a new promise and mention a set timeout here, maybe like 5 seconds, and we can maybe resolve it with 1. So, and we can just, as usual, let's say, what do we have here? P1, okay, P1 dot, then there's the thing that we had been doing so far, right? So we can just check for the resolve here, and for catch we can just show the data for the error. So basically this can be useful for simulating an API or something like that. Let me just run it. 1 2 3 4 5. Yeah, so yeah, my countdown was wrong anyway. So as you can see, this is like a deep sleep simulation. So basically imagine this like an external API that is coming from an external server. It will take some time, and you can just simulate the same for if you don't wanna get to that API. So obviously we can do a reject here, and after 5 seconds we are getting the same. We can also show failed or some message will be shown here in the error, and we can just change it to 100 millisecond, so it will be quickly shown to us. Yeah, so yeah, this is like a summary of Promise APIs, Promise Combinators, and I hope you like the video. Comment down if you have any doubt and share this video maybe, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.